This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger speaks with Giselle Donnelly, Senior Fellow in Defense and National Security at the American Enterprise Institute. Giselle and Roger discuss the ongoing war in Ukraine, American foreign and defense policy towards Ukraine and Taiwan, and the challenges facing American national security.
Miss Giselle Donnelly, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Roger. It's good to see you again.
Now, you are a senior fellow in defense and national security at the American Enterprise Institute, and you focus on national security and military strategy. You were on the Armed Services Committee staff, which is absolutely the most distinguished element of your bio, given you and I share time in the HASC. We won't talk about the Quadrennial Defense Review, which you introduced. That we'll leave that as an inside joke. Which ultimately got struck from the Title 10 U.S. Code. But you are someone who focuses and writes frequently on Ukraine, which we'll talk about, as well as author of a new book. Just give us a little
elevator speech
on this new publication, Tom.
Well, you know, Roger, it's interesting because I would say certainly one of the big inspirations for writing the book or the series of books was my time as an Armed Services Committee staffer. Luckily, I never rose to the heights of being a staff director like you did and had to,
You just elevated me. I was a mere general counsel and deputy, but I appreciate that.
Whatever. You had to manage the herd. So that was that's the hardest part of the job. I certainly remember that. But it was when I was there in the 1990s and mid 1990s after the infamous or famous Gingrich revolution, and during the Balkans Wars, it was an interesting time to serve. And just long story short, the chairman, Floyd Spence, and the other senior members of the committee were obviously very skeptical of anything that had Bill Clinton's name on it. If Bill Clinton was for it, they thought maybe they should be against it. But oddly enough, pretty quickly, I was struck by how this underlying, principled and moral instinct emerged. Those guys probably still couldn't tell you the difference between a Serb and a Croat and a Bosniak, but they knew that there were good guys and bad guys, and atrocities going on, and that America had the power and sort of the moral obligation to prevent the bad stuff from happening. I mean, again, it wasn't a complex philosophical point, but it turned the most conservative members into people who thought that American intervention in what was described as the small teacup war in Central Europe was a pretty vital American interest. And it made me wonder, well, especially since we don't have the Soviet Union as a framing construct for how we should behave in the world, what are the internal motivations that push us forward? And like everybody else, I read through the founding era when you're a staffer and you have a lot of time on your hands waiting for members to summon you, and you have access to the Library of Congress, you can do some pretty deep research just sitting around waiting for stuff to happen. And I just kept going backward and backward, trying to discover what the motivating roots of American behavior in the world were, and that's led to this series of books.
I
began. There's a logic here that was sort of inescapable, and that was in the original English colonization of North America. You read the sort of rhetoric of the time, and it sounds so modern. It sounds like us. First of all, they're in a great power competition with Habsburg Spain, and they're behind, like way behind. Spain's gotten all the low-hanging fruit from the Aztecs and the Incas, and it's up to English colonists to in order to compete as a European great power, they have to be a global power. It's a newly globalized world, and those are the external realities of
Give us
the
the name of
time.
the book and hold it up for our viewers.
I shall. I'm more than happy to do so. I hope if you can read it. This is volume 1. Actually, the title of the series is "The Personality of American Power." This is a George Kennan quote. I'm sort of using Kennan's techniques from his famous articles of 1946 and the Long Telegram. And the title of volume 1 is Empire Imagined. So this is kind of the primordial ooze where our approach to military power sort of crawls out of the swamp.
Empire Imagined. We'll have to have you back to go in depth on this and the colonization.
I can make 8 shows for you, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, great. Well, we'll start with this and we'll just keep on building,
Okay.
But actually, as you're describing this book series and what piqued your interest and your reflections on your time in the House Armed Services Committee, and you have, Floyd Spence was a chair from South Carolina, and he didn't like anything that Bill Clinton was doing, but then looked at the Bosnian War, as I heard you say, and kind of thought about it in terms of good guys and bad guys, and this language of moral obligation is what you said. That's probably a good launching point to talk about the war in Ukraine, which is something you write about frequently in your perch at AEI and think deeply about. Now, Republicans these days don't like to talk much about moral obligation when it comes to foreign policy and national security. Certainly many Republicans don't. Even those who believe there's a moral obligation in foreign policy tend to retreat to a more realist argument and think about what is and is not a vital national security interest. Giselle, why is Ukraine prevailing in the conflict, in the war with Russia, vital to U.S. national security? You did a bit of an eye roll there for our viewers. It's kind of like you're tired of having to make this argument, but do it one more time for us.
No, I'm delighted to do it, actually. But I guess I'm puzzled a little bit why people find this hard to grasp. I mean, this is about the balance of power in Europe as it exists now. And that has always been the number one security interest of the United States. Again, if you went back to if you had George Washington on your program, or Alexander Hamilton or somebody like that, they would think, well, they saw themselves as emerging as a country in the midst of a contest between revolutionary France and Great Britain. So they were keenly aware of the European balance of power and how America's interests were inextricably intertwined with that. And circumstances have changed. We are no longer the weak power that we were in 1787 when the Constitution was ratified. But our interests remain the same. And also, it is a critical element in sort of what I would describe as the three-legged stool of global power. The balance of power in Europe, the balance of power in East Asia, and the balance of power in the greater Middle East. Those have been the three principal, since time immemorial, and certainly since the end of the Second World War, very explicitly, the three regions of the world that go into making what Bob Kagan describes as the world America made. And it's not simply a good thing, but it is a good thing. It's good for us. It's good for other people. It makes us rich in a way that we've never been rich before. It makes us secure in a way we've never been before. And it is a manifestation of the principles that hold this country together.
Well, so balance of power, good realist arguments. Henry Kissinger would head nod at what you're describing here. We don't have to talk about morality and moral obligations and the like. But there's something else going on, Giselle, and that is it's the 20th anniversary of the war in Iraq.
Right.
And it feeds the discussion about what happens when the U.S. sticks its nose into regional conflicts or invites itself and get into these endless wars. We're not good at this. It results in the loss of blood, so many lives lost, and treasure as well. And so here we are, 20 years post Iraq. Doesn't it make sense for people to say, hey, we don't need to do anything that would lead to escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. We could stand with the Ukrainians. We could even give some money, although $100 billion perhaps is more than we should give, or certainly enough. But let's not do anything that's going to result in escalation and a wider conflict in Europe, when then it's going to be more treasure and possibly blood. So that is a concern you're hearing across the country, certainly by elected Republicans or some, and one that seems to be resonating in the polls. So, with the shadow of Iraq, Giselle Donnelly, and you and I worked on this, on Iraq, that is, when I was in the Armed Services Committee staff, and you were the thought leader for the American Enterprise Institute. Here we are, 20 years later. Is there some credence to this argument?
Well, I would certainly take the point that the way that our failure in Iraq has cast a long shadow over American strategy ever since. I hope this is an occasion for the beginnings of a more thoroughgoing evaluation. I'm not trying to relitigate Iraq right now, but I would just say what it shows is the consequences, not of us sticking our nose in, but of sticking our toe in the water. And again, this is a subject for probably 12 more programs, but the big failure to me, I mean, we kind of end up in the worst of two worlds kind of situation. Committed to the invasion, but not the reconstruction of Iraq. So we tried to just sort of take a slice of the pie rather than consider the pie as the whole. And I worry that we would be repeating a similar mistake, or could repeat a similar mistake in the case of Ukraine, by abstracting Ukraine, by thinking of it as just a border dispute in the most narrow way possible, rather than an element in this larger picture that touches on our vital interests that we described earlier. So, and one huge difference between Iraq and Ukraine is that there's a consolidated, real, unified Ukraine. I mean, the bloodshed that Ukrainians have suffered is just extraordinary.
Oh, no doubt. There are so many differences.
No, I mean, we should back a winner. We have a clear winner, which we can back at no cost in American lives, and a relatively low price in treasure to reap a great strategic reward. It's there for us.
Particularly what the great, what strategic reward is. Couldn't you make the argument, hey, here we are a year plus into the conflict in 2023, and the Russian conventional military has been degraded. How much more are we going to get? So, that kind of,
I just think that's
strategic calculus. We could check the box on what more do we have to gain?
An immense amount. I mean, I would look back, and another one of my recent endeavors has been a podcast that I do with a couple of my AEI colleagues and Middle East Institute colleagues.
Go ahead, shamelessly promote that podcast.
I mean, there's enough of a podcast universe for both of us, Roger. And people who listen to our podcast would like to listen to yours, and vice versa. This is a mutual back scratching thing. So it's called the Eastern Front. This has again sort of been one of my enduring bugaboos, if you will. After the Cold War, there was a whole swath of Central and Eastern Europe, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, that was liberated from Soviet oppression. Much of that was incorporated into the West, into NATO, into the European Union, but some of it wasn't. And in fact, Ukraine in particular, arguably the most important strategic piece of the puzzle, was left out, with the consequence that this part of Eastern Europe has been a no man's land and a temptation to Russian revanche ever since. So we're seeing something that we, to the degree that we created the circumstances, it was not because we were too forward leaning in expanding NATO, but because we didn't see the whole picture, and we left, breadcrumbs out there or pieces of chum in the water for the sharks of Moscow to attack. This is our opportunity to rectify that strategic error. Again, it's not just the Ukrainians. I mean, how the Poles have transformed themselves militarily. Man, they've turned themselves into the kind of NATO ally that we've been dreaming about.
Tell us more about that. I mean, they have certainly been, and geography.
Yeah, they're
to do with this, right? I mean, they are building up their defenses, and they are the most aggressive in terms of giving Ukraine support in the form, most recently, of MiG aircraft, right? So fighter aircraft.
Right.
But take us through where the Poles were and where they are now, a year into this war.
Well, the Poles were very forward-leaning, amongst the first tranche of Eastern European states that did join NATO. And for all their domestic troubles, which are serious, they have been the most aggressive, the most forward-leaning members of the NATO alliance in Europe ever since. The size of the Polish army, notably, another thing that we've learned out of this is the superiority and the wisdom of the Reagan defense buildup. It's just incredible to see that F-16s and M-run tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, all the elements of the Reagan buildup that really haven't, unfortunately, been replaced since then, still are the frontline weapons, the most capable military systems.
Just contextualize that for a second. What you just said is
nobody understands this, right?
As military platforms, and we love talking about Ronald Reagan here on Reaganism. So I'm not fighting you on this at all, Giselle. It's invited, but military platforms that the Reagan administration bought at scale.
Right.
That kind of came online probably his second term, end of his second term during the Bush 41.
Right.
Here we are, approaching 40 years later. In some cases, 40 years later, is the top shelf military equipment that you can buy in conventional armed conflict. Now, I realize there's been upgrades, and iterations from some of these things, but that's your point, right? Here we
exactly
build up what we're using in 2023.
Right. The M1 tanks that the U.S. Army is operating. Right. They've got enough electronics hanging off them to it's a huge upgrade from what it was. But the hulls that house all these systems and so on and so forth, they're built in the 1980s. Okay. So the advantages accrued by the Reagan defense buildup still continue to pay enormous dividends and have rescued us from our kind of, negligent attitude about defense spending since then. So we owe President Reagan, not the United States, but Western Europe and the Western world, our allies owe Ronald Reagan a huge debt of gratitude.
About defense top line, obviously, that's another area where you lead on, and you have for years now on the budget. But let's stick with Ukraine for the next few minutes. Recent Wall Street Journal op-ed by Nikki Haley, of course, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, governor of South Carolina, and presidential hopeful. Title of the op-ed: China wins if Russia conquers Ukraine. And what she is getting at is really a debate within Republican circles that our support for Ukraine may actually cut against the more important fight, which is deterring China and, in the event of a conflict, prevailing against China. She absolutely takes the side of it's the opposite, that if Ukraine wins, it helps us vis-a-vis China. And she attacks kind of two lines of argument and two camps. The Biden camp for not doing enough, and you've written about this as well, really kind of the slow drip of support as opposed to dealing this in an urgent fashion. And then she attacks conservatives who say that this is merely a territorial dispute, and you've just hit on this in part. Why don't you give us your take, Giselle, on the argument that Nikki Haley has outlined in the Journal recently, and this discussion of how we balance and how Ukraine impacts China and China or Taiwan and the China-Taiwan, which is that's the immediate concern, impacts Ukraine.
Well, just to connect it to our last conversation, I mean, the world has seen the quality of Western weaponry and the commitment that motivated military forces such as the Ukrainians have fielded, the battlefield effectiveness of that combination. So what is the question about the use of American power? These days, it's a question about our willpower, our domestic staying power, which after the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan that President Biden initiated, 18 months ago, had hit a real nadir. And I have to say, I'm both frustrated beyond measure, but surprised pleasantly in the reaction of the president, because, again, after Afghanistan, I wondered whether he would have the moxie to even do what they've done. So they've both exceeded my expectations and failed to meet the necessity of the moment. That's sort of a classic Joe Biden thing.
Joe Biden, of course, early on, this is prior to February, explicitly said that he would accommodate or allow a minor, quote unquote, minor incursion. So, it was Afghanistan, not only his behavior in terms of allowing this sort of thing, but then said he would, wouldn't have a problem with part of Ukraine being chewed up by the Russians.
Well, yeah, and no doubt his thinking was affected by this sort of curious because it continues, feeling that the Russians were a truly powerful, great power, second best army in the world. That whole myth that still hangs on. But to go to the second half of Governor Haley's argument, the idea that this is simply a border dispute is just really a cover story for a larger attitude about, it's almost the old Gene Kirkpatrick blame America first mentality, not coming out of the mouths of radical leftists, but coming out of the mouths of the right wing of the Republican Party. I mean, the sort of inversion of the Reagan legacy is really quite striking. I think it's strategically myopic. It's uninformed. But that is the political landscape and of course, we should not forget that these people don't have the votes. I mean, you're a creature of Congress, Roger. Vote counting is what we do, right? But at this point, they don't have the votes. They do have they've captured the Twitterverse of the right-wing Twitterverse. So there's still a contest going on between the Nikki Haleys and the Mike Pences and the Mike Pompeos. There's also a competition for the hearts of the America Firsters. And it'll be interesting.
And they're getting after that, and they want to make sure that,
finally to go to the China point and to tie it in too neat a bow. The Chinese are watching us not much more for much less for the tactical and technological lessons to be learned from Ukraine, although those are not unimportant. But the fundamental question for the Chinese is, will the Americans come to the aid of the Taiwanese or the Japanese or our East Asian allies in the event of a crisis or a war? And this is very much about you can dismiss this as, sort of Washington blob thinking, but the idea that our credibility in the world is, unimportant and easily, something that doesn't carry over from one case to the next is very hard for me to swallow.
Right. And whether or not, we can stick by friends and allies, or if we get tired and give up. And
right. And that is the message that we have been transmitting for the last 20 years.
Dig in a little bit more, because there are two camps. There's certainly one camp that's kind of America first and looks at Iraq and Afghanistan and uses the rhetoric of forever war. And really they would just prefer to build up walls on our border and leave the world to whoever, fills the vacuum and thinks that we as a country would be better off. That's one view. Neo-isolationists, let's call it that. What about the other camp, which actually believes deeply that the U.S. has vital national security interests in Taiwan and more broadly in the Indo-Pacific, and they believe that Ukraine is the distraction from really doing the investment and hard work that's required to put the United States in a better position to deter China. And one more point on this, Giselle, and I'd love for you to respond. I think there's some merit to this argument. I'm not persuaded by it, but there is a cautionary tale. Regardless how you feel about Iraq, Giselle, it's very clear that decade after 9/11, or a decade and a half, until President Trump was elected, the United States didn't focus on China, or certainly didn't adequately focus on China. There are lots of reasons for it, but one reason from the security lens is because we were dealing with the Middle East, and we have suffered as a result. So it's reasonable for me for an analyst out there to say, hey, you know what? Bad things happen when we don't focus on the biggest problem, right? Adversaries get the advantage. And as much as we think we can get after both problem sets, we're not going to do it as well if we're trying to do two things at once. Again, I'm not persuaded by that argument, but I do think it's quite different than the neo-isolationist mindset that says just build walls. Now, they seem to be playing with each other, and I think it's a deal with the devil, and it could undermine those I care deeply about dealing with the China threat. But attack that one, Giselle, because it's really out there, and there's some some good points that you have to deal with.
Well, Roger, there is one tiny legacy of my service in Congress that still endures, and that's the annual China military power report.
Yeah, but the cutest one. You deserve the cutest for that.
Well, okay, I'm happy.
Tell everybody what that is. Why you deserve the award.
Well, it is sort of a recycling of, again, you've put me in a very Reagan mindset of the old Soviet military power report that President Reagan and his administration used so effectively to justify and to rally domestic political and indeed international political support for the defense buildup of the 1980s. So by drawing attention to the nature of the Russian threat of the late 70s and early 80s, which all the smart people were saying was something that we couldn't respond to, and therefore had to cut a deal with the Soviet Union, had to take Kissinger and detente to another level. So knowledge is an empowering tool, and it's taken a long time. And just to tell, the Clinton administration offered that as veto bait for the defense authorization bill back in the day. But that also tells us what was really going on in the 1990s, and that was not that people were there are two elements. Yes, they were focused on and after 9/11, yes, they were focused on the Middle East, but we were also viewing China through the lens of trade and business expansion. So it wasn't simply that our security focus was directed toward the Middle East is that it was also the case that there was a powerful and larger justification for, and it was not unreasonable to think that you might be able to achieve some security arrangement or stability with the Chinese.
No doubt. But let's fast
forward. But
right.
Yeah. Okay. So, and let's also deal with the actual military facts of the case. I mean, if we need a bunch of Stingers and javelins to defend Taiwan, we've already lost.
Okay.
So militarily, these in a Venn diagram sense, these dangers do not overlap hardly at all. So it is that is a complete canard. We can't use destroyers or submarines too much. So can't get them into the Black Sea.
Let's just kind of translate that argument, because that.
Okay, so we're if the Indo-Pacific is primarily or largely an air and maritime theater, Central Europe is a land theater. Okay, so militarily quite different cases. There is a serious question, as you will well know, about the attention of senior leaders, their ability to think about two things at the same time. Particularly, it's probably even worse now in a social media, hothouse environment. But again, if that's the disease we are going to be suffering from, we're kind of already behind the eight ball to begin with. I mean, we need to be able, if we're going to be a global power, we need to be able to balance these things in decision makers' minds.
All right, here's what I'm hearing from you, Giselle.
Yeah. Just to summarize. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just because you reference some of the platforms or weapons that the United States have given to Ukrainians, and they're the ones that, for limitations on industrial capacity, we were given to Ukraine, and our stockpiles have gone down, and others have said, okay, well, shouldn't the focus be on China, and therefore, while we're giving this stuff to Ukraine, give it to China? And you say, well, the sort of things we're giving to Ukraine in a land conflict would not be relevant to Taiwan. But isn't there a kind of take it up one level, right? Take it up one level higher, which is say, the $100 billion that have gone to Ukraine, or the $50 billion of which that are security assistance, and the type of time and effort that you see our Secretary of Defense devoting to Ukraine, if we just were to do the same thing to the types of weapons and kind of security diplomacy for dealing with a Taiwan scenario, we'd be in a much better position. I'm sympathetic to that, because here we are year over year, we're talking about things we need to give the Taiwanese, and they just sit kind of on back order, and we're giving the same types of platforms, I don't know, to the Saudis ahead of, and there are reasons for that, to those in Taiwan. So, at that level, perhaps not on the munition for munition or weapon for weapon basis, it's less compelling, but at a broader level in terms of the effort and focus, one more time, Giselle Donnelly, why is that not a compelling argument?
It is. I mean, the need to sort of, revive the arsenal of democracy is a very serious question, and a serious worry of mine has been for some time. But again, that the cause of that is not driven by Ukraine and the supplies that we've given to Ukraine, and won't be solved one way. The outcome in Ukraine won't, if the Ukrainians are either defeated in short order or triumphant in short order, it's not like our position vis-a-vis China is going to be materially affected one way or the other. And there's another factor to be considered. And as again, you look, Japan's becoming sort of like the Poland of the Western Pacific.
Right.
And that is strategically crucial. There's nothing that makes the Chinese quake more than the prospect of a conflict with Japan. They have awful memories of World War II, for very good reason. But the fact that Japan is emerging from its pacifism
Sure.
is a great benefit to us strategically. It's going to bring great initial or further resources. Likewise, the recently concluded AUKUS deal, the deal between the British, the United States, and the Australians to supply the Australians with nuclear submarines. I mean, that is like something that I couldn't have imagined back in my government.
You're commenting, hey, we're in the context of this emphasis on Ukraine, if I understand you correctly, and the Biden administration, in your judgment, I share your view, perhaps is not doing enough with the speed and urgency required, but they're doing stuff, right?
Yep.
They've also, at least in the kind of this security diplomacy, have netted or kind of two really good outcomes. Perhaps they're not responsible for entirely, but certainly have encouraged. One, Japan really doubled down in terms of their defense investment and working with us to deal with security challenges posed by China. And two, this AUKUS deal where working with Australia and United Kingdom, we're going to provide the Australians our submarine technology, which of course is our comparative advantage as we think about how we could deal with the Chinese assault on Taiwan. So those are things that we're kind of doing in parallel, and it demonstrates that, hey, we're doing two things at once and netting some benefits.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's true. And that's evidence that our sort of attitudes as a global power still have a lot of resonance, because these are, policies that have kind of been translated from one administration to another. Sure. All administrations have fallen short of what I would have recommended in both cases. But it's nice to see at last first of all, for us to actually respond appropriately to grave strategic dangers is a change, and to consider things in the global context is something that we have not done very well since the end of the Cold War. So the glass isn't even half full yet, but at least it's beginning to be filled up.
As we go to the end of our conversation here, again, we're with Giselle Donnelly, who with the American Enterprise Institute, where she is a senior fellow in defense and national security, talking about Ukraine, talking about China and Taiwan, and tension between the two, and investment in our national defense. Let's migrate over to another area where you have deep expertise and a long record, which is what is the right level of investment in our national defense? You were talking about the arsenal of democracy and how there's a lot of work to restore that. And earlier in our conversation, talking about the Reagan buildup and how it's continues to have an impact on international security and benefits our United States national security interest. I had an event here at the Reagan Institute not too long ago where we were talking about industrial capacity. That is, we've had these weapons shortfalls, particularly munitions, and the reason why we have the shortfalls, we don't actually make enough of this stuff, and we don't have the capacity to make more of it. And it led to kind of this moment where the same kind of core ingredients to making a munition that's relevant to Ukraine, Giselle, actually is relevant to the types of munitions and weapons you would need for Taiwan. Now, it's not the same weapon itself, but the ball bearing, for example, would be
right.
that. And in that respect, there's an argument to be made that if we were to invest in our industrial capacity, like the foundational elements, and we would be doing it because of the general support to Ukraine, it would result in actually a benefit in terms of what needs to be done for a potential Taiwan scenario. I see some head nodding there. Talk about that for a minute.
Well, I would add also we could make some money on it as well. Our allies have long understood that and it's been demonstrated by the long service of the Reagan era platforms, that American-made weaponry is really the best in the world, just flat out superior to what others have been able to produce. And they would still like to be. That's why there's such a backup, and there was before the Ukraine war started in the platforms. People were queuing up to buy M1 tanks, to buy Patriot air defense missiles, to buy F-16s and F-35s. Alas, we have let our shipbuilding capacity really atrophy in kind of a catastrophic, way. Not only the strictly naval shipyards, but the commercial shipyards that
we simply don't build ships here anymore.
No. So that has been that's a self-inflicted wound of that possibly is the greatest of all. So again, this is another hole we've been digging for several decades now, and it'll take us a while to get out of it. But people are finally coming to realize that the source of the problem is just the lack of investment. Okay, these are companies that have, there are weird business structures. If Lockheed Martin turned a 20% profit year over year, the way Apple does, Congress would be investigating it 17 days a week, right? So
as it should be. That's monopoly.
Well, okay. Okay,
but there's a difference between Apple and a company that 90+% of its sales, whatever it is, come from U.S. taxpayer dollars. I mean, I think that's
but Lockheed has to raise money on a commercial market, so the government doesn't really. It buys stuff, and it's also a very picky customer. The government can determine what it pays for stuff. Imagine going to the butcher and saying, "That's a really nice piece of sirloin you got there. I'd like to pay 69 cents a pound for it."
Fair enough. I didn't mean to distract.
Okay. No, I didn't mean to go down this rat hole either. But so we're capitalists in one way and socialists in another way. But seriously, you get what you pay for. Okay, that is the fundamental truth, and we have not paid to keep that technological advantage that was bequeathed to us by Ronald Reagan. It's lasted longer than anybody could have expected, but it is not eternal, and it requires continued investment. I mean, the Reagan defense buildup at its very, very peak was still only 6% of gross domestic product.
Right.
We're hovering and have been hovering more at the 3% range.
Half of what you had during that period.
Yeah. So don't be surprised that you don't get.
Well, you and I are in alignment on this, and I had the opportunity to testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee, not too long ago, and I was advocating because of the challenge in Europe, because of the challenge Indo-Pacific with China, and because of the industrial capacity limitations. That you add that all up, I'm not a mathematician, but I can do basic addition, and it kind of takes you to 5% GDP. Now, that's $1 trillion, Giselle, excuse me. That's the sort of thing that, it's hard for members to get around. And it's certainly in this environment of the huge deficit to say, hey, we can't afford that. So you're eye rolling.
No, I mean, again, let's just keep things in perspective. First of all, it's still a nickel out of what the economy produces, out of every dollar the economy produces. So it's a very small slice of, we are a rich nation. There's no question about that. It's also pittance compared to, the pandemic spending we did. The pandemic stimulus was 5 times larger than the annual defense budget. So, our ability to spend money is very case dependent, right? But there's nothing, first of all, and as I'm sure you will agree, the first business of the national government is to secure. Yeah. Okay. So that's like in the Constitution, right? And the logic is compelling. So, you got to look at things in proper perspective in order to make sober decisions. the money that we spend on national security is a huge value proposition. It gives us the ability to, to be secure wherever we want to go in the world, to trade wherever we want in the world, and occasionally to lift people into political liberty around the world. That's the purpose of our country.
And we happen to be in a particularly challenging environment.
Right.
I'm not. You and I didn't advocate for 5% GDP or 60% GDP a decade ago. Well, I didn't. Perhaps you were. But the point is that this notion of the U.S. having military supremacy, which we achieved, at the end of the Reagan administration, held on to through 9/11 and into the last decade, has eroded considerably. And now we find ourselves in a place where there's parity in a lot of areas. And I think that, to me, is really the beginning of the discussion. The Russian military has failed in Ukraine. It's exposed that its conventional military is not what we thought it would be, but they are modernized and their nuclear capability is real. So you have that. Plus, you have a China that is investing in its national defense, 7% growth year over year. And we're no longer the top dog, or if we are the top dog, they're getting very close. That is a market change. And it goes back, Giselle, to your work where you called for, you as a staff member, the China military report. And if that, to me, more than anything else, is the beginning of the answer as to why we need to invest. Now, we have to answer questions. Why do we have to invest in our national defense at a level that's more than most nations in the world combined? And, you and I can kind of break that down and explain why that makes sense. But put that aside, at the end of the day, it's a very different world right now because our economic security, our economic prosperity, and the peace we've enjoyed has been closely tied to our military supremacy. The military supremacy goes away, it puts at risk that economic security and that prosperity. That's the equation.
Yeah. Look, the Ukraine war reminds us that deterrence can fail. If we look at the world through the minds of a dictator like Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, we have to see that Putin doesn't care how many Russians are killed to capture Bakhmut. Would Xi Jinping be casualty sensitive if he decided to make a play for Taiwan? No, their whole the existence of their political order is premised on their power. So, when we think about deterring China, we're trying to create an effect in the mind of our adversaries. Okay, the numbers contribute to that. So does their calculation of our commitment, and in some ways, that's the most important connection between the two wars, beyond the sort of geopolitical reasoning. If we want to prevent Xi Jinping from taking a shot at it, we have a very high bar to meet. And again, he's willing to, if he's going to cross that threshold, he's not going to do it in a tentative way, and he's not going to be watching the body count in a daily way, the way that we might.
Giselle Donnelly, we're going to move to the lightning round. Thank you for the conversation covering Ukraine, China, defense budgets, Republican hopefuls and their views on national defense and national security. Now let's test your prowess when it comes to Ronald Reagan. You've been good throughout this conversation to sprinkle in Reagan references. We always appreciate that for the historical context. Here we ask you for your favorite book on President Reagan, your favorite speech by President Reagan, and your favorite Reagan quote. What do you got for us?
Well, let's start with a book. I'm actually currently reading Will Imboden's new book, fairly new book, the The Peacemaker. You know, I'm a child of the Reagan era, to be sure. You know, I'm the child of Kennedy Democrats. So I came into the thing that turned my, you know, I remember vividly voting for Ronald Reagan for the first time, not in 1980, but 1984. It was like, you know, it was like an act of rebellion against my parents or something like that. But it was a life-changing moment. And I think Will comes at it from a perspective that really resonates with me. So I would commend your listeners.
Peacemaker. Okay.
Yeah, it's a great book. Second one, Roger. Well, it hit me. Speech or quote? That's what I think.
Whatever you want.
Okay, so I got to vote for Tear Down This Wall. Okay, I mean, you know, in our trade, the only thing that gets us out of bed in the morning is the feeling that we might be freedom fighters, right? You know, winning is good, but winning in the cause of freedom, of human liberty, is even better. And you just can't beat that moment. Instead of building walls, tearing down walls and setting people free is kind of the way I think about the purpose of the United States of America. So you can't beat that one.
Now that's your speech. What's your quote?
Well, no, that's my quote. I'm using that as the one line.
Okay.
You know, if you had to say the one line that encapsulates the president's approach to things, it would be that. So, and I would offer the Pointe du Hoc speech as my favorite, again for similar reasons. My dad was a World War II guy, and not just because, you know, you look at that speech, it's very brief, but also the event and the setting.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of my professional career has been concerned with issues related to the U.S. Army. And so the picture of those Rangers, you know, retired, the guys who climbed the cliff behind, you know, it just, you know, brings tears to my eyes every time I watch the video of it. So that's my favorite.
Iconic moment, but you think,
but for the visual as well as the words.
Yeah. And then, I believe gets credit for really kind of seeing that through. But it was quintessentially Ronald Reagan, his admiration for the military and commitment to restoring faith, confidence, and celebration of those who served. As you know, Doug Brinkling wrote an entire book about how that speech almost ushered in the era of thinking about your father's generation as the greatest generation. Of course, Tom Brokaw coined that, but in some ways it began when Ronald Reagan delivered that speech.
Well, look, those were his people. He venerated them, and he held them up as, you know, the distillation of everything American. And, you know, when we think of ourselves, you know, the struggle to get up a cliff to begin the liberation of the European continent, to sort of semi-quote the speech, that's something to be really proud of.
Giselle Donnelly, great to have you on the show. We got to have you back to talk about your first of 4 volumes. There we go. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Raj. Be well. It's good to see you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.